السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأصلي وأسلم على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. رب زدنا علما، رب زدنا علما، رب زدنا علما نافعا. آمين. I welcome everyone to the first session of the readings from النور المبين في قواعد عقائد الدين. This treatise is the compilation of a great Imam from Muslim Spain who does not need any introduction. He is Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Juzay al-Kalibi al-Gharnati al-Maliki, a great scholar from Spain who is famously known as Ibn Juzay. He is more famous for his tafsir Ibn Juzay, and he has compiled some great works in Islamic theology, tafsir, usul al-fiqh, and other sciences of Islam. This work, An-Nur al-Mubin fi Qawaid Aqaid al-Din, is about understanding the basic qawaid of Aqidah based on the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can see the translation on your screens. The clear light, fundamentals of religious beliefs. This is a treatise in Ilm al-Kalam, the science of Aqidah, which focuses on explaining the Aqidah based on definitive rational evidences. And in explaining these fundamentals of Aqidah, this work takes the book of Allah, Quran, as its guide and source. So usually when we hear about Ilm al-Kalam and applying aql in Aqidah, we fall into the discussion about bid'ah, innovation, and taking our Aqidah only from the book of Allah and Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We should not rely on aql. Intellect is not the source of Aqidah in Islam, so on and so forth. We have these discussions, the sayings of the Salaf, the sayings of the early pious predecessors about Ilm al-Kalam, Mutakallimin, the scholars who engaged in understanding Aqidah only based on aql. They were rejected. This methodology was rejected by the Salaf, by the Sahaba and Tabi'een. It is a later innovation. All this discussion which happens. In understanding all religious matters, we must take a balanced approach as Muslims. We should not go to the extremes. We must remain on the fine balance of Islam in all affairs. And this applies in both understanding and practice. So, for example, the common mistakes which happen in understanding these matters is going to the extremes, going to either extremism or neglect. For example, when we hear about the saying of the early scholars against Ilm al-Kalam, like the saying of the great Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, detesting this field of knowledge and declaring that anyone who engages in understanding this and studying this field should be punished by the authorities and some particular punishments have also been suggested in the narrations, so on and so forth. But if you go back to the sources of these narrations and try to understand the context of these sayings, contextualize the sayings about these matters, you will be astonished to discover a completely different narrative about Ilm al-Kalam. So for example, this saying of Imam al-Shafi'i, where does it come from? It has been narrated by the great Shafi'i scholars in their books with connected chains. And before we apply a narration from early Salaf scholars and create a narrative based on that, we must make sure that the narration itself is authentic. It has a chain, and the chain is sound. So where does it come from? For example, in the case of Shafi'i and this narration, that the punishment for those who engage in Ilm al-Kalam is that they should be placed on donkeys and exposed in the marketplaces, and they should be shamed by the authorities. And then after shaming them, punishing them, the authorities should declare that this is the punishment of those who leave the path of Quran and Sunnah and engage in Ilm al-Kalam. Now, if you go back to the, and before we understand the narrations, a Muslim becomes very confused when he sees some great Imams of knowledge in the past engaging in this field of knowledge, like Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, Al-Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, even Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Al-Imam al-Bukhari, because the treatises which they compiled, the positions which they took, whether we disagree or we agree with them, or whatever methodology we follow in these matters, whatever opinions we align ourselves with, at the end it's all Ilm al-Kalam. When Imam al-Bukhari, who is accepted as the greatest muhaddith of all times, and his work Sahih al-Bukhari is the most authentic book after the book of Allah, when he compiled his work about voluntary actions of human beings, khalq wa af'al al-ibad, the af'al, voluntary actions, are they created by Allah, or is a human being, does a human being have free will in these actions? He is discussing Ilm al-Kalam. He is explaining a very deep and profound mas'ala of Ilm al-Kalam, which is al-Qada and Qadar, divine decree and divine destiny. The disagreement between the sects and schools of thought about this mas'ala is primarily focused on the voluntary actions of human beings. In voluntary actions, the actions which are not in our control are agreed upon. The Muslims, they agree that these actions are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because it's not in our control. But what about voluntary actions? And then we have this mas'ala of qada and qadar. We have different sects taking different positions. So Imam al-Bukhari, when he compiled Khalq wa Af'al al-Ibad, which is a book taking a particular position, declaring that voluntary actions of human beings is creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is taking a position in Ilm al-Kalam. So either you remain silent or you take a position. If you're taking a position, whatever it may be, you are engaging in the discussion about Ilm al-Kalam. So coming back to the example, we cannot go into all the narrations. This one example will suffice because it is a very famous narration, repeated and shared on social networking about Ilm al-Kalam. If you go back to the original source in which this narration appears, for example, we have the book of Imam al-Bayhaqi, Al-Hafidh al-Bayhaqi, who was a great muhaddith and the Shafi'i jurist, mutakallim, and he has clear acceptance in Ilm al-Hadith. His works are accepted by all Muslims across the spectrum in Ilm al-Hadith. But we forget that the same scholars who are accepted in Ilm al-Hadith, they compiled works in Aqidah. And it's very astonishing to see sometimes, because of ignorance, we see some people, they reject a scholar in Aqidah and accept him in Hadith. So the scholar is an authority in Hadith, but his Aqidah was wrong. This is the most astonishing statement you will ever hear in your life. How can a scholar be very profound and authority in Hadith in a branch of sciences, Islamic sciences, and his basic Aqidah was wrong? The foundation of Islam was wrong. If he was a genius in Hadith, in Usul al-Fiqh, in Tafsir, why didn't he understand the basic Aqidah first, which is understanding which is obligatory on every Muslim? So coming back to the narration, when you read the narration in Manaqib al-Shafi'i, the original source about Shafi'i compiled by Imam al-Bayhaqi, his life, his teachings, narrated with connected chains to Shafi'i, you will see that Imam al-Bayhaqi explains the meaning of this narration. He says, this narration in which Shafi'i is rejecting Ilm al-Kalam and suggesting that the authorities should punish mutakallimin and all those who engage with this field of knowledge, is basically rejecting al-Kalam al-Bid'i, innovative Ilm al-Kalam. And after this narration, he comes with, he brings narrations with connected chains to Shafi'i, in which Imam al-Shafi'i himself understood this field of knowledge. And he praised al-Kalam al-Sunni, Sunni Ilm al-Kalam. So basically, what is the difference? The difference is using rational evidences, for definitive rational evidences, to prove the fundamentals of Aqidah based on Quran and Sunnah, and rejecting the wrong interpretations of Quran and Sunnah, rejecting wrong rational interpretation, and rejecting some weak aqli rational evidences as well. This is the only difference. So this is something different from rejecting the aql altogether, which is praised in the Quran in many verses. Aql is manatu taklif. Aql is the base of legal responsibility. So a human being, when he reaches puberty, he's responsible for his actions. He becomes mukallaf. If he dies after puberty without accepting Islam, he or she is in hellfire. And if the same human being dies before reaching puberty as a kafir, as a disbeliever, he is not in hellfire, because he did not cross the age of legal responsibility. Now this punishment, success, and felicity and punishment on the last day is based on aql, because puberty is about reaching an age where you can understand things properly. It's about aql. That's why the scholars say al-aqlu manatu taklif. Aql is the foundation of legal responsibility. So aql is a great ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has praised aql in the Quran in many verses. Allah has praised the people of intellect in many verses. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has praised the people who use their aql to its utmost potential, ulul albab, in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to use our aql in day-to-day affairs in a simple manner, understanding profound realities. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to engage with the texts, with the revelation, with the wahi, which has come through the prophets, by using our aql. And in fact, how do we understand the existence of God? How do we understand the authenticity of prophethood? By using our aql. This is very clear in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For this reason, the scholars, they devised methodology of engaging with the book of Allah and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in Aqidah. You require aql, intellect, in all sciences, in day-to-day affairs, as a human being, as a Muslim, as an intellectual, understanding, extracting masail, understanding higher realities, concepts, whatever. The scholars, they devised a methodology in engaging with the texts in a rational way, in a rational manner. However, we must understand the fact that the early Muslims did not require this ilm. The early Muslims did not, their condition did not necessitate this ilm. Because the early Muslims, Sahaba and Tabi'in, they accepted Islam without any cultural baggage. Islam was revealed. The last and final messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was selected from the Arabs. And this is a wise decision from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, there were more civilized, if we can use this term, nations, like the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, but they had their cultural and intellectual baggages. Arabs were free from these things. As they said, the guitar of the Arabs contained only one string, straightforward. And Islam needed these people. So the mission of Islam in future needed people who don't have great intellectual and cultural baggage. They are simple in their approach, in their intellect, and in their practice. But when Islam spread, the Persians and the Romans and other nations entered Islam, particularly those who did not understand the language of the Quran, the language of Islam. They came with their cultural baggages, intellectual baggages, they came with their philosophies, and they had these questions. So the scholars of Islam, they developed this field of knowledge in order to address this challenge. Otherwise, we said the Aqidah of Islam is rational Aqidah at the same time. But we have to explain rationality. Rationality according to the conditions of Islam. Rationality can be according to the conditions of the West or the East or other religions. Rationality according to the conditions of Islam. So Iman does not mean blind faith. Iman, translating Iman as faith is wrong. Iman means certain faith. That's why you will see in the Quran other synonyms of Iman are al-yaqeen, for example, certain faith, yaqeen, and other synonyms. So Iman does not mean blind faith. Iman means certain faith based on definitive evidences. So belief in Allah, that Allah exists, Allah is one, He, for the guidance of mankind, He has revealed the message of guidance through His prophets, belief in the prophets, belief in the angels, belief in the last day. These basics of Aqidah are based on certain and definitive evidences, qati evidences. We will come to that. So we must enhance ourselves, broaden our canvas in understanding these matters. The early scholars from the Sahaba and Tabi'in in particular did not engage in these matters because there was no need. So if we have a Muslim society which believes in Islam, practices their religion, and applies and implements Islam in their societies, we don't need to create confusion by doing an intellectual engagement with the text, raising questions and confusing them. There is no need, because the end result is being applied in their society. The end result is Islam. The end result is implementation of deen in our societies. If it is achieved, we don't need to address these methodologies and questions. However, if there is confusion, if there are questions, the Aqidah of Muslim society is being threatened, like in our times, because of the exposure of whole mankind, including the Muslims, to the Western system of thought, the Western civilization, skepticism, humanism, and all these isms and Western ideologies. The religious belief or religion itself and religious people generally have become a minuscule minority. The religion of the West traditionally was Christianity. Now they have divorced all forms of religious thought. So religious thought means primitive thought, pre-modern thought, old thought. Religious people are becoming minority in the world. All religions, conservative people, conservative thought. So the basic morality is being threatened, the basic aqaid are being threatened, the thinking patterns are being changed. So if this happens, we must confront this onslaught. That's why the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, they say it is fardu kifaya. It is a communal obligation to have one scholar, at least in a particular community, who understands these matters, who understands philosophy, who understands the reality in which they are living, like we are living in the Western reality, who understands the Western systems of thought, and also engages with Quran and Sunnah based on rational evidences, understands Ilm al-Kalam and the challenges, so that he can protect that community, Muslim community, from the onslaught, intellectual onslaught. That's why we see atheism is being promoted and spreading in our communities. And our traditional scholars, because they don't have exposure to the reality, most of them, and their approach with the texts, the book of Allah and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is reductionist. They don't apply these ulum as they should be, like the scholars of the past used to. We are experiencing decline in the religious practice and in the Islam as a whole, particularly in the young generation, because of the militant secularism which is being applied in the curriculums, in educational system, in thought patterns, and whatever. So the point here is understanding these matters in proper context. What we lack is contextualizing knowledge. So that's why, as I said in the beginning, people go to extremes regarding Ilm al-Kalam, either neglect or extremism. Okay, so this is a brief treatise. It is not a mutawwal matan. It is not a lengthy text about this ilm. It is a brief treatise which can also be understood by a common Muslim, compiled by Al-Imam Ibn Juzay. And as I said, the main focus of the Imam is to make us understand that this ilm is connected with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The different forms of evidences and methods mutakallimun applied in this ilm are taken primarily from the Quran, from the book of Allah. There can be influences in the branches, in some discussions, it happens. Civilizational exchange, influences between ulum, when you are particularly exposed, in these times of globalization, you cannot live in isolation. A civilization, a nation, people cannot exist in isolation. Ideas are shared and the exchange happens, intellectual exchange happens, which is natural. And it should also be checked and balanced by the scholars. What can we take from others and what can we benefit from them, what we cannot take, how can we give, to what extent we can share our legacy with others, what are the intellectual matters which we have to confine ourselves in, so on and so forth. This can be discussed. However, it must be understood that the foundation of this ilm is based on the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was explained early by the propounders of this ilm. Like we know in the Sunni theology, Ilmul Kalam, the greatest school or the greatest schools are three. And those who have taken different positions after them, they pick and choose from these three big schools of theology. We have the Mu'tazili school of thought, the Ash'ari school of thought, and the Maturidi school of thought. So now a person can ask, where do you place Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, who claims to follow the early Salaf, going back to the Puritanic version of Islam? Basically, what he claims to be Puritanic version is his ijtihad, which we must respect. He was a great scholar, and a free thinking mind, mujtahid. And a mujtahid can also commit mistakes. It's not a problem. So like, for example, in Qada and Qadar, as we said, Qada and Qadar, understanding the voluntary actions of human beings, are they created by Allah, or is a human being, does a human being have free will in his voluntary actions? We have the Mu'tazili opinion, the Ash'ari opinion, and the Maturidi opinion. The Mu'tazili and Ash'ari are the two extremes, and Maturidi is in between. So Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and his students, like Ibn al-Qayyim, has a full treatise, full book on this mas'ala of Qada and Qadr. He takes the Mu'tazili opinion. And when these scholars engage in polemics, they have their own methodology. What the opinion which they take, they try their best to prove that this is based on Quran and Sunnah. It's near to Quran and Sunnah. And this was the Aqidah of the early Sahaba and Salaf. But a student, everyone claims this. Even Mu'tazila, if you read their original books, they claim that we are the inheritors of the legacy of the Sahaba. They use the term Salaf in their works. However, a student of knowledge must apply the manhaj of naqd. A student of knowledge must apply the method of critique, understanding. Only polemics will not work. A scholar is convincing us by his beautiful eloquence that the position I'm taking is the best position. Only this will not work. Eloquence does not work in these matters. We must understand the evidences he is giving. We must understand the authenticity of those evidences. The istidlal, the extraction, the understanding, interpretation of those evidences must also be balanced. Understanding these matters is important. So the founders like Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahimahullah, was a great mutakallim and a scholar. He wrote a treatise which is available. You can read it, download it. He called it Istihsan al-Khawd fi Ilm al-Kalam. It's a brief treatise, few pages. Istihsan al-Khawd fi Ilm al-Kalam. Engaging with this field of knowledge is mustahsan, it's praiseworthy. It is not detested, it's praiseworthy. And in that he addressed these questions. Why didn't Sahaba engage with this field? Why is it missing in the times of the Sahaba? Why can't we only rely on the apparent meanings of Quran and Sunnah? He has explained with details. And what he says, like, we cannot go into the detailed discussion about the treatise, but the main point which he emphasizes on is that the evidences discussed in Ilmul Kalam and the methodology, rational methodology, in explaining those evidences, we have taken it from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not based on only pure intellectual exercise. We have taken it from the book of Allah. And he says the main ayat or the best ayat to understand these matters, or which are beneficial in understanding the rational evidences, is the polemics of Ibrahim alayhi salam with his nation and also with the ruler in his times. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he engaged in polemics with his nation in explaining the higher realities of Aqidah, like the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the oneness of Allah. We know the ayat in which he pointed to the sun and said, this is my Lord. it would be mistaken to say that Ibrahim alayhi salam, na'udhu billah, was a polytheist. He worshipped sun, he worshipped the moon, he worshipped the stars, and later on he made tawbah and he came to Islam. This is wrong. All mufassirun have agreed when interpreting these ayat that Ibrahim alayhi salam did not worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. He was engaging in polemics with his nation because they were worshipping these things. So this is usloob, this is a style of explaining. So sun is bigger, and if the sun is God, it should not vanish in the night. If the moon is God, it should not set in the day. If the stars are gods, the God must be defined, the qualities of God must be defined, and these qualities are not maintained in these things, so on and so forth. So he says the discussion of these matters, we take it from, for example, from these ayat and the polemics of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So the point which I'm making is that in order to understand these matters, in order to understand these ulum, we must contextualize knowledge. We should not become naive in our approach. We should not adopt reductionism in understanding these matters. And same is the purpose of Imam Ibn Juzay in this treatise, connecting the basics of Aqidah and Ilm al-Kalam with the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need these things more in our times because of, as we said, because of the Western onslaught on the minds of the Muslims, particularly the youth. Okay, so let's read from the beginning pages of this treatise, and inshallah we will, as we have agreed, we will read it with explanation wherever it requires explanation. This is the translation of An-Nur al-Mubin fi Aqaid al-Din by Imam Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi al-Gharnati from Granada, and he was a Maliki scholar. He died in 741 after Hijrah. So he is a scholar of 8th century. This is the translation, and he has focused on 3 principles. The first fundamental is about divine matters, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his oneness, and other allied masail, the being of Allah, the attributes of Allah. The second fundamental is about the other basic pillars of Iman, belief in prophets, belief in angels, and other matters. And then we have the third fundamental, which is about hereafter, and some connected masail about hereafter. This is the basic Aqidah of Muslims. Now, we'll skip the introduction of Imam Ibn Juzay. He's famous. You can read about him. He is a very famous scholar. Let's read the author's preface. Al-Imam Ibn Juzay, rahimahullah, he says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama taslima. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, peace and blessings be upon our Master Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and upon all his family and companions. The expert jurist, scholar, and all these alqab titles, they are not from the scholar himself. Usually, the method of the early scholars was they would dictate their works and the students would copy. The students would copy and they would compile handwritten manuscripts. So they would add these titles as a praise for their teacher. The great scholar, Abu Ja'far Ahmad, son of the jurist scholar and noble and pure wazir, Ahmad ibn Abul Qasim al-Kalbi, may God be pleased with him, said. So this paragraph is from the copier or the student. Praise be to God who guided us to faith and taught us the Quran. Peace and blessings be on our Master who called us towards the best of religions and who was sent to man and jinn, and upon all his family and companions and those who follow them in goodness. Praise be to God who guided us to faith and taught us the Quran. So faith and Quran are interconnected. And in fact, Aqidah is from the basic foundations of Quran. We know the famous hadith in which the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he declared Surah Al-Ikhlas 1/3 of the Quran. Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ is 1/3 of the Quran. And in explaining the meaning of this hadith, the scholars, they say that if we divide the themes of the Quran, main themes, we can say that the Quran comprises of 3 main themes. Aqidah, explaining the Aqidah, the stories of the previous nations, and the Ahkam, the law. So these are the 3 main themes of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Aqidah, explaining Aqidah, particularly explaining the existence of God, his names, attributes, what are the rights of God on his creation, and what are the rights of the creation on God, so on and so forth. The details about Aqidah is 1/3 of the Quran. So in this way, understanding, reading Surah Al-Ikhlas is as if you are reading and understanding 1/3 of the Quran, because 1/3 of the Quran is Aqidah. So Quran and Aqidah are interconnected, and this ilm al-kalam, the basic evidences and methodology has been taken from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The detailed explanation of this mabda concept of taking the evidences and explanation methodology from the book of Allah has been explained by the great Imam Al-Razi rahimahullah in his tafsir Mafatihul Ghaib, which is a lengthy tafsir, and if you study it properly, you will find the ayat about Aqidah have been connected by Imam Al-Razi with the principles of Ilm al-Kalam in a more detailed manner. Then he says, this is a book in which we have mentioned religious beliefs. This is a book, ذكرنا فيه عقائد الدين, Aqidah, religious beliefs. Basically, whole ilm of Aqidah is about understanding the explanation of the 6 pillars of Iman, with all discussions, sects, groups, deviant groups, mainstream, fringe elements, whatever. It is all about the 6 pillars of Iman. Belief in Allah, belief in his angels, belief in the books he revealed, belief in the prophets, belief in the last day, and belief in the divine decree. Belief in Qada and Qadar. These are the 6 pillars of Iman mentioned in the famous hadith of Jibreel. Whole Aqidah, ilm of Aqidah, focuses on these 6 pillars. This is a book in which we have mentioned religious beliefs that must be held by all Muslims, and for which we have established definitive logical evidences. In Arabic, وَأَقَمْنَا عَلَيْهَا أَدِلَّةً أَقْلِيَّةً قَطْئِيَّةً. I think logical is a loose translation, because in Arabic it does not say logical. Logic is a particular field of knowledge. All logical evidences are not definitive. In Arabic, he said, أَدِلَّةً أَقْلِيَّةً قَطْئِيَّةً. Rational, definitive evidences. Definitive means qat'i, in which there is no ihtimal, in which there is no probability of doubt. So evidences are of 2 types, qat'i and dhanni. Evidences are of 2 types. It says definitive evidences. So we have evidences of 2 types, qat'i and dhanni evidences. Qat'i and dhanni. Qat'i means definitive. Qat'i is definitive. and dhanni is speculative. Which are also accepted, but there is ihtimal. So the texts also revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ayat of the Quran, they are not all definitive in meaning. Whole Quran is qat'i in narration. But there are dhanni ayat as well. Yani there is room for more than one meaning. That's why we have ijtihad as a valid institution of understanding. Okay. So aqli evidences are qat'i and dhanni. Aqidah can only be based on qat'i evidences in which there is no probability of doubt. Definitive aqli evidences. Now, as we said, there are scholars who disagreed with many kalami arguments and kalami evidences. If you understand their critique, like the critique of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, but in particular, if you understand it in proper context, not only taking quotes here and there from his books, but engaging with his legacy properly, reading all his books, comparing the texts, understanding the context, you will realize that he was not against aql and using aqli methodology in Aqidah. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, and his students, and those who engaged in critique of Ilm al-Kalam, they are basically against some particular evidences. They are against two things. Number one, confining the evidences in the Kalami Adillah only. Yani, if you want to understand rational evidences, these are the rational evidences 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And beyond these rational evidences, there are no evidences with which we can engage. Ibn Taymiyyah did not accept this idea. He said evidences are of many types, and if the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, they discovered and they established some particular evidences, we will see some of them can be weak, some others can be sound. We will engage according to the circumstances, but there can be other evidences. So confining evidences of Aqidah in only Kalami evidences, they did not accept this idea. Number two, they engaged in critique of some particular evidences which they considered weak. Okay, because the mutakallimun, they have this condition that in Aqidah we will only accept definitive evidences. So Ibn Taymiyyah does a critique of some evidences. He says, for example, this evidence is not definitive, and he explains it with his arguments. This is a loose evidence. This is a weak rational evidence. Okay, so this is the actual context for the critique of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, or scholars who engaged in critique of Ilm al-Kalam. So they were not against aql. No Muslim scholar can reject aql completely. No scholar can claim, Muslim scholar can claim that there is no role of aql in understanding Quran, in understanding Islam. This is falsehood. This is against Quran itself. No Muslim scholar can reject all aqli engagements, evidences. So basically, they were rejecting these two important problems, which according to them is the area of critique about ilmul kalam. Now, for example, if we take an example because this is a very important mas'ala. The main discussion in ilmul kalam is about evidences, understanding rational evidences, and differentiating between definitive evidences and speculative evidences. This is the main discussion. For example, if we take the example of Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, he says in his work Madarij al-Salikin, which is a book about tasawwuf. It is a commentary on the famous Sufi text compiled by a great Hanbali scholar, Manazil al-Sa'irin, the stations of the pious, by Imam al-Harawi, rahimahullah. Ibn al-Qayyim wrote a detailed commentary, and in that he engaged, as usual, in critique of many different groups from the Muslims. He engaged in critique of mutakallimun, of Sufiya. Now listen to this. I will read this. This is about Aqidah, and then we will compare these words with a famous Ash'ari scholar, mainstream scholar of Aqidah. Ibn al-Qayyim, he says, I'm reading from Madarij al-Salikin, فَمَا كُلُّ مَنْ وَجَدَ شَيْئًا وَعَلِمَهُ وَتَيَقَّنَهُ أَحْسَنَ أَنْ يَسْتَدِلَّ عَلَيْهِ. It is not possible always that if a person, a particular scholar, understands an evidence or a thing, understands it and believes in it with certainty, he will be able to prove it in the best possible way. And this is not necessary. That if you know something, you know it with certainty, with definitive evidences, you have the acumen of proving its existence in the best possible manner. And this is not necessary. فَمَا كُلُّ مَنْ وَجَدَ شَيْئًا وَعَلِمَهُ وَتَيَقَّنَهُ أَحْسَنَ يَسْتَدِلَّ عَلَيْهِ وَيُقَرِّرَهُ وَيَدْفَعَ الشُّبَهَ الْقَادِحَةَ فِيهِ. And it is not necessary that a person who believes in something with certainty will be able to repel the doubts about it, will be able to counter and argue for it, because science of argumentation is a field which everyone cannot excel. So you may believe in something, but you don't know how to prove it. You may believe in something, but you don't know how to engage in arguing for it. And if a person casts doubts about it, he comes with a doubt against your belief, you may believe in that thing with certainty, but you may not know how to convince this person. This is a possibility. فَهَذَا لَوْنٌ وُجُودُهُ لَوْنٌ. This is different from that. Believing in something with certainty, with certain evidences, is different from being able to argue for it and to counter the arguments against it. These are two different things. ولكن لا بد مع ذلك من نوع استدلال قام عنده. But in spite of that, this person who believes in something, like a person who believes in God, must have a basic dalil. He must have some dalil about which he is convinced. So for example, a common Muslim or a common person who believes in God, he must have this basic dalil. If you ask him, why do you believe in God? He says, because I reflected on the universe around me. I reflected on the cause and effect, the principle of cause and effect around me, and I feel that there is a creator who has created this great equilibrium in this universe, so on and so forth. Basic istidlal, which means the belief of a person about a thing will never be without istidlal, without dalil, without evidence. But this person may not be able to convince others about that dalil, may not be able to present his belief in the best possible manner. He may not be a great speaker. He may not be a great person who can argue for his belief. Which does not mean, so if a person is not able to convince others about his belief, does not mean that his belief is necessarily corrupt. Or a person who has great eloquence in convincing others does not necessarily mean that his belief is correct, or his position which he is arguing for is correct. وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ عَلَى شُرُوطِ الْأَدِلَّةِ الَّتِي يُنَظِّمُهَا أَهْلُ الْكَلَامِ وَغَيْرُهُمْ. So it is not necessary to believe in a particular certain reality only based on the conditions propounded by the scholars of Ilmul Kalam and the particular order in which they understood these evidences. We have to reach the end product. The end product is belief in God. Okay, I believe in God and I have certain belief in Allah, and this belief, it influences my life. It changes me as a human being. Now, how do I believe in God? What are the evidences? Doesn't matter. You may have your own evidences. Another person may have his own convictions. There are different stories between different human beings. So believing in Allah only based on a certain set of evidences in a particular tartib, in a particular order, is not necessary. This is the critique of Ibn al-Qayyim against Ilm al-Kalam. He says, what he's saying is basically that in this science, Ilm al-Kalam, the mutakallimun, they suggest that we should believe in these certain realities based on their evidences only. The evidences which they propounded are the only rational evidences. And also believing in these evidences in a particular tartib, in a particular order which they have created. This is not necessary. Okay, now this is different from rejecting Ilm al-Kalam altogether, rejecting these evidences altogether. He is not rejecting. فَهَذِهِ لَيْسَتْ شَرْطًا فِي التَّوْحِيدِ. This is not a condition in Tawheed, in understanding the oneness of God. لَا فِي مَعْرِفَتِهِ وَالْإِلْمِ بِهِ. Neither in understanding the oneness of God, وَلَا فِي الْقِيَامِ بِهِ عَمَلًا وَحَالًا. And nor in applying it practically in life. فَالْإِسْتِدْلَالُ كُلِّ أَحَدٍ بِحَسَبِهِ. Every human being has his particular way of istidlal, particular way of understanding things. It may be corrupt, it may be wrong, it may be right. That is there, but we cannot confine. ولا يحصى أنواع الاستدلال ووجوهه ومراتبه إلا الله. No one can encompass the types of evidences and the methodologies of engaging with those evidences except Allah. So evidences are unlimited. The methodologies of engaging with those evidences are also unlimited. فَلِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ هَادٍ. For every nation there is a guide. وَلِكُلِّ عِلْمٍ صَحِيحٍ وَيَقِينٍ دَلِيلٌ يُوجِبُهُ. And for every correct form of knowledge and certain knowledge, there is an evidence which proves it. You cannot confine that evidence. وَشَاهِدٌ يَصِحُّ بِهِ. And a witness which becomes the proof of its authenticity. وَقَدْ لَا يُمْكِنُ صَاحِبُهُ التَّعْبِيرَ عَنْهُ عَجْزًا وَعِيًّا. But it is possible that a person who believes in that knowledge, which is certain, based on correct evidences, may not be able to explain it, may not be able to defend it. He may not have the capability. وَإِنْ أَبَّرَ عَنْهُ فَقَدْ لَا يُمْكِنُهُ التَّعْبِيرَ عَنْهُ بِإِصْطِلَاحِ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ وَأَلْفَاظِهِمْ. Or even if he is able to explain it, he may not be able to explain it according to the terminology of the scholars. He may be able to explain it in a very simple way, but that does not change the end product. وَكَثِيرًا مَا يَكُونُ الدَّلِيلُ الَّذِي عُرِفَ بِهِ الْحَقُّ أَصَحَّ مِنْ كَثِيرٍ مِنْ أَدِلَّةِ الْمُتَكَلِّمِينَ. And many times it happens that the evidence of a common man is stronger than the evidences of the mutakallimin and the scholars who engage in ilm al-kalam. وَأَبْعَدْ أَنِ الشُّبَهِ. And the evidences of a common man are far from the doubts. وَأَقْرَبَ تَحَصُّلًا لِلْمَقْصُودِ وَإِيضَاحًا إِلَى الْمَدْلُولِ عَلَيْهِ. So sometimes the evidences of common masses which they believe in are better than the evidences of scholars who engage in rational methodology. Okay. Now, when you reflect on this, on these words of Ibn al-Qayyim, it becomes very clear that he's not rejecting aql. He's not rejecting the engagement with aqli evidences. He's only trying to correct the approach which we must adopt in engaging with these evidences. Now let's go to the words of a great Ash'ari mutakallim. Now he is from Ilm al-Kalam. He is from the Kalami tradition himself. The great Imam al-Sannusi. And his works are the basic foundations of understanding Ilm al-Kalam, particularly Ash'ari theology. Imam al-Sannusi, he compiled some basic texts about Ilm al-Kalam, like al-Barahin is a basic text, and he wrote a commentary in that of this text. He compiled small texts and big works on Ilm al-Kalam. For example, in his sharh, in his commentary on his text al-Barahin, the foundation of all evidences, in explaining the same mas'ala, adillah, evidences, rational evidences, he says, if a person asks about the rational evidences, he says, وَأُجِيبَ بِأَنَّ الْمُرَادَ بِالدَّلِيلِ الَّذِي تَجِبُ مَعْرِفَتُهُ عَلَى جَمِيعِ الْمُكَلَّفِينَ هُوَ الدَّلِيلُ الْجُمَلِي وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَحْصُلُ فِي الْجُمْلَةِ. If a person asks about dalil, which necessitates ma'rifah, knowledge of Allah, on all mukallafin, on all human beings, is a general, al-dalilu jumali, general dalil, without going into the details. وهو الذي يحصل في الجملة للمكلف العلم والطمأنينة بأقائد الدين. It is a general dalil by which a human being can reach ilm and certainty about the aqidah, about the belief system. Listen to this. ولا يشترط معرفة النظر على طريق المتكلمين. It is not a condition to understand these evidences or to engage with these evidences according to the method set by mutakallimun. It is not a condition, because it was a need. They created the method. They just want to reach the end. The fruit is aqidah. The fruit is certain belief. So if you can reach that end without this path, it is okay. ولا يشترط معرفة النظر على طريق المتكلمين من تحرير الأدلة وترتيبها ودفع الشبه الواردة عليها. It is not a condition to understand these matters based on the particular set of evidences and the order of the evidences created by the mutakallimun. This is not a condition. Who is saying this? The great Ash'ari mutakallim himself. Okay. So by this, the context becomes very clear. Inshallah, we'll stop here for tonight, and we will continue with the discussion in the next sessions. And our plan is to study and read this work, which is a brief treatise with explaining the relevant masail. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us understanding of Aqidah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq of raising our intellectual capabilities so that we can serve the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We can serve Islam in the current times of trial, tribulation, and skepticism. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by His beautiful names and exalted attributes to cure our sick and to forgive all our dead. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala nabi al-ummi. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you have any questions, please write in the chat box in a brief manner. And the questions must be relevant according to the sessions we are taking, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. What is your view on Allah fi sama? Allah is above sky, as mentioned in the Hadith Jariyah. We'll come to that. Have some patience, inshallah. Once we explain the basic aqaid and basic principles, these things will become clear. This is another problem. When we neglect the basic foundations and we fall into the polemics and discussions about branches here and there, about a particular attribute of Allah, about we reduce this ilm to only discussion about attributes. See, for example, in this mas'ala, the discussion will come, but briefly speaking, no mainstream Muslim group rejects the Quran, ayat of the Quran. If a person rejects the Quran, he's not a Muslim, let alone a scholar. And we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being above the throne, has come very clearly in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is above His arsh. Allah is above the throne. However, the scholars have disagreed about the meaning of being above the throne. What is the meaning of above the throne? Why did they disagree? Because Allah is not a jism. Allah is not a body. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing like Allah. So as human beings, we only understand things based on our limited capabilities of intellect. What we have perceived, we only understand that. Even our khayal, even imagination is connected with the faculties of hiss, the five senses. So for example, you can imagine the head of an animal on a human being, or the arm of a human being on an animal. You cannot go beyond that. You cannot, your imagination cannot trespass the limits of the limits of five senses, because we can understand what we perceive. The being of Allah is above aql. The being of Allah is above five senses. Okay, that's why tawqif is a very important principle in Aqidah about Allah. Tawqif, yani limiting our intellectual capabilities, stopping where Allah stops us. Whatever Allah has revealed in the book of Allah, in his book, the messenger of Allah has explained about Allah, we stop there, because we accept the limits of our intellect. So accepting the limits of the intellect is a very basic principle in Islamic epistemology. What I'm saying is, they all agreed on Allah being above the throne. And if someone tells you Asha'ira, Maturidiyya don't believe in this, this is falsehood. This is absurd. Go and read their books. They all believe. They only discussed about the meaning of being above the throne, and the meanings in which the polemics happened. Does it mean julus? Does it mean istiqrar? Does it mean this and that? Give me a moment, please. 1 minute. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So yes, basically, the mainstream Muslim groups in Aqidah, they agree on the basics. The discussion is about the details. Sometimes the difference of opinion is only in mustalah, in istilahat, in terminology. Okay. By mainstream, we mean the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyya, the Hanabila, the Muhaddithun, the Athari legacy. And even sometimes Mu'tazila. Yani if you read Mu'tazila from their original sources, you will realize that this disagreement is in the branches and the discussions. Some of those discussions are irrelevant. And for example, a Mu'tazili, and they are not present in our times, just for the sake of argument. A Mu'tazili, doesn't he believe in oneness of God? He believes. Doesn't he believe that God has a dhat, a being, and sifat, attributes? He believes. The only discussion is about the place of the attributes. Are the attributes of God something separate from the dhat, from the being of God, or the attributes and the being of God is the same thing. And these are polemical discussions which happen in our history. Some of these discussions are irrelevant. Some are very relevant to our times because of, as I said, the Western onslaught, the atheism and stuff, and Western ideas, so on and so forth. Inshallah, we'll discuss what are the major schools of thought in Aqidah within Islam. The major schools of thought in mainstream Sunni theology are three: the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyya, and the Hanabila. And they always, particularly Asha'ira, Maturidiyya, and the Hanabila, they engaged in polemics in history. They engaged in critique of each other, because the Hanabila and Muhaddithun, they believe in sticking to the basic apparent meanings of the texts, and we don't go beyond that. We don't need to engage in rational methodology and stuff. And we have, like the scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he says in a place, he says that I was the most keen to create sulh, reconciliation between Asha'ira and Hanabila in his times. So, however, this all is our legacy. Yani, if you study about the different schools of thought in Aqidah and the sects which appeared in the history, we have some original sources. Like, for example, the book of Imam Abu al-Hasan Ash'ari is an original source, Maqalatul Islamiyyin, the narratives of Islamiyyin. Now, reflect on the title. It's very interesting. Maqalatul Islamiyyin, the narratives of the Muslims, because they are all Muslims. Even the deviant sects, they are Muslims, except very extreme and fringe elements. These are discussions between Muslim sects. So the 73 sects mentioned in the hadith, they are Muslims. They are not disbelievers. We have to understand this fact. Some are deviant, some are to the extreme, some are mainstream. Even in mainstream, there is discussion between them, so on and so forth. So we should accept this as our legacy, engage. And engagement does not mean agreement. Engagement does not mean agreement. Engagement means, and engagement has its terms and conditions based on the circumstances and times. Engagement is when you sit together, you agree on the basic matters, and you accept the epistemological space of others. You accept that my opponent, my khasm, has the right to truth like I have. So as a Muslim, I claim that what I understand is true. I should accept that my opponent has the same right. He has the right to truth. He has the right to explain his position. There is no problem in that. Let's come on the middle ground. That's why I said the majority of these masail are basically in branches. No one disagrees in the basics. And I said the 6 pillars of Islam. Who disagrees? As a Muslim, all agree in belief, believing in these 6 pillars: belief in Allah, belief in His angels, belief in His books, belief in the prophets, belief in the last day, belief in Qada and Qadar. They disagree in the branches, and this happens. The discussion and difference of opinion, schools of thought, is a very natural process in all big civilizations, because Allah has given us uqul. When a civilization grows, and growing of civilization also means intellectually. When we have scholars, they start the thinking process, they initiate, so on and so forth. So khair, inshallah, this will suffice for tonight. If you feel that this is beneficial, please join the course. It will be, yes, the admin has shared it here. Join the course, inshallah, if you feel that is beneficial. We will engage in these discussions throughout the course, and the duration is 8 sessions, inshallah. I'll take your leave. See you, inshallah, in the next session. Bi-idhnillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi